Section 1. Hey guys, tonight we're heading deep into the green, windswept corners of early medieval Ireland, to a time when monks wore wool robes, shaved the front halves of their heads for obscure theological reasons, and just maybe invented the world's first travel snacks. Picture this: a stone monastery huddled near a cliff, the Atlantic crashing below like a beast that never sleeps. Inside, candles flicker. Not many, wax is expensive, but enough to cast sleepy shadows on the walls. Somewhere between the chapel and the scriptorium, you hear the soft shuffle of sandals. And there, by the kitchen hearth, a group of monks are slowly, deliberately, bundling oats and dried berries into little leather pouches. They're not talking, of course. Silence is the rule after sundown. But you get the sense that if they could talk, they'd be grumbling about Brother Cormac burning the last batch of barley biscuits. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking now, slowly into the fog. It's early morning, and the Abbey's bells are still a few hours from ringing. A chill hangs in the air, not the bone-deep cold of winter, but the damp, clingy kind that makes your robe feel like it grew moss overnight. The monastery isn't large. Most weren't. Maybe 20 monks live here, give or take, depending on who's off wandering, praying, or pretending not to nap in the herb garden. The buildings are squat, round-roofed, and built from whatever the local stones offered. The paths between them are muddy but well-trodden, marked by bare feet and centuries of patient trudging. In the kitchen, technically called the Chiolana, though no one's fancy about it, you find the day's work already underway. A sleepy brother Owen stirs something in a cauldron that smells like porridge and repentance. Nearby, another monk slices dried apples with the intense focus of someone trying not to think about anything else. Historians still argue whether these early monastic communities prioritized food innovation or simply made do. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. What we do know is this: early Irish monks had a knack for preservation. They had to. Their lives were rhythmic, repetitive, and deeply mobile. Monks didn't just sit around copying books and ringing bells. They traveled, a lot, to visit other abbeys, to share sermons, to escape Viking raids. And when they did, they needed food that could last. Hence, travel snacks. Not granola bars or jerky, but humble oat-based cakes. Sometimes mixed with honey, if they had bees. Sometimes with fruit, if they'd been drying it in the rafters. Occasionally with nuts or seeds, though those were more luxury than staple. Wrapped in cloth or leaves, tucked into belt pouches or slung over shoulders. Eaten slowly, carefully, with an air of solemnity that probably wasn't entirely about the divine. There's something endearing about the idea that while other cultures were busy inventing siege engines and siege ladders, Irish monks may have been inventing the spiritual cousin of the flapjack. You walk past the kitchens, stepping carefully over a sleepy cat that clearly outranks everyone here, and into the cool stone hallway. Somewhere in the distance, a quill scratches parchment. A door creaks. A rooster, confused by the fog, gives up crowing halfway through. Your stomach rumbles, not from hunger but in sympathy. After all, you skip the midnight gruel in favor of extra sleep. But don't worry, a small bundle waits for you on the ledge near the chapel. Inside, 2 barley cakes slightly overcooked, 1 dried fig wrinkled with age, a pinch of salt, and a single note in impeccable Latin. Eat in silence. Walk with grace. So you do. Section 2. You walk now along a dew-slick path that curves gently away from the abbey, past low stone walls and lazy sheep that glance up only to resume chewing with holy indifference. The bundle of snacks weighs lightly at your side, bouncing with each careful step. You're not in a rush. No one in these parts is. Except maybe the chickens. They seem to have somewhere urgent to be. Today's destination is a smaller outbuilding near the edge of the monastery's land, a place the monks call the rule house. Not for governance, but for storage. Inside are scrolls of regulations, food ledgers, a broken bell no one's fixed, and a remarkably detailed diagram of how not to stack cheese. But more interesting than all that is the wall of recipes, or what passes for them. This is where we begin to understand that snacks were not casual in the cloister. They were regulated, scripted, even spiritual. Take, for instance, the rule of St. Columbanus, strict, short-tempered, and suspiciously obsessed with discipline. His followers were allowed 2 meals per day, nothing between, unless, of course, you were traveling, or ill, or had just copied a particularly long manuscript. That's where the loopholes emerged. Monks being monks, they found ways to turn necessity into liturgy. Travel nourishment, one dusty parchment proclaims, should not delight but should suffice. Soft when chewed, dry when carried, and not so sweet as to encourage gluttony. A lovely way of saying, pack light, no fun allowed. Still, monks got creative. They found ways to stretch meager supplies into edible, carryable rations. Crushed oats mixed with water, pressed flat, and baked on a hot stone. Hard cheese rolled in ash to preserve it. Fruit cakes made from last season's wrinkliest apples, dried in the rafters and rehydrated with cider when things got festive. One curious entry describes chew balls, a mixture of barley flour and goose fat, formed into small spheres and left to dry in the sun. Reportedly favored by monks sent on diplomatic missions, probably because they were too tough to eat quickly and thus occupied the mouth during tense silences. You step inside the rule house. It smells of dust, parchment, and faintly of old onions. A window lets in a soft, early light. On the wall, a small shelf holds what looks like stone but is in fact a centuries-old remnant of a dried honey cake. St. Fintan's Feast loaf reads a tag beneath. Unbitten, venerated, possibly petrified. Historians still argue whether monks considered food sacred or simply necessary. But in practice, the boundary blurred. Each meal began with prayer. Each ingredient was sourced from the land with care and recorded, often in beautiful script. Even the simplest loaf had a ritual attached, a blessing, a moment of gratitude, and if you were lucky, a smear of wild honey. You paused to read another line half-faded. He who hoards the barley shall find his cupboard bare come frost. Possibly a proverb, possibly a passive-aggressive note left by Brother Brendan for Brother Podrick. A bell rings faintly in the distance. Not the chapel bell, this one softer, woodier. The meal bell. You follow it through the wet grass to the refectory, where monks are already gathering. They don't speak. They nod, smile, occasionally raise a crust in greeting. On the table, bowls of porridge, a small dish of berries, and each monk's personal travel bundle, neatly folded in cloth. You sit, unwrap yours, and break the barley cake in half. It's dry but not unpleasant. The salt cuts the blandness. The fig is chewy, earthy, just sweet enough to suggest the sun. You chew slowly. Across from you, a monk is smiling around his own mouthful of chew ball. Silence is the rule here. But food speaks in texture, in ritual, in the slow knowledge that someone, 100 years ago, stood exactly here, chewing exactly this, and looking out the window at the same damp sheep. And like you, they were probably wondering how something so simple could feel so complete. Section 3. Midday arrives without much ceremony. Just a slight brightening of the sky, a shift in bird song, and the faint hope that the barley stew won't be burnt again. You wander beyond the Abbey's main grounds now, through a wooden gate that creaks exactly like a door in a ghost story. Ahead lies a humble structure, a low stone granary with a thatched roof and a perpetually muddy doorstep. The monks call it the storehouse of enough. Inside is a world of carefully hoarded blandness. Baskets of oats, bundles of barley, sacks of rye, and a solitary jar of lentils that nobody wants to talk about. There are no spices, no flourishes, just the holy trinity of early Irish grain, hearty, grayish, and spiritually chewy. And here lies the truth of it. Medieval Irish monks didn't have a lot to work with. Their pantries were defined by what could grow in shallow, often soggy soils. Oats thrived, barley endured, wheat, rare, precious, and usually reserved for altar bread or diplomatic cookies. You step inside, greeted by a monk sweeping up oat husks in a cloud of dust. He gestures to a pile of round loaves stacked in a neat little pyramid. Yesterday's batch, he whispers, despite no rule requiring whispering in storage rooms. It's just the vibe. The loaves are dense, browned on the bottom from hot stones, and faintly sour, thanks to natural fermentation. Not sourdough as we know it, but something similar. Monks discovered early on that letting porridge sit a bit too long made it both tangier and oddly more satisfying. A theory still hotly debated by historians who study ecclesiastical baking. All three of them. Further back, you spot flat rounds laid out on wicker mats to cool. These are oat cakes, the backbone of any monk's satchel. Thin, crackly, and perfectly sized for folding into cloth. No yeast, no eggs, just oats, water, a pinch of salt if they were feeling wild. You pick one up. It's surprisingly light, with the texture of something you might scrape off your boot. But when you nibble the edge, it's not bad. Nutty, toasty, completely inoffensive, which, in monk cuisine, counts as success. There's a quiet pride here. These monks didn't have cinnamon or almonds or saffron, but they had time, and patience, and a lot of oats. They experimented. Some oat cakes were cooked twice, first on stone, then near the fire to dry. Others were rolled thinner and sandwiched with wild apple slices or crushed rose hips. A few daring souls even tried soaking oats in leftover ale, which resulted in a surprisingly cheerful biscuit until the abbot banned it. You notice a note tacked to a beam. Soggy is not saved. A kitchen reminder, perhaps, or a proverb for life. Outside, you hear the clink of a pail, Brother Kian returning with goat milk. He waves, spills half, and laughs. Milk scones tomorrow, he calls. You nod. You've had them. Like bread if it never tried. Historians still argue whether these snack baking habits were original to Irish monks or borrowed from Roman practices. There are hints of influence, but the simplicity feels indigenous, developed from scarcity and sanctity alike. You step out of the granary and into the cool sun. A monk passing by offers you a hard cheese rind, already nibbled at the corners. Still good, he says with a shrug. You pocket it. Waste not. Back inside, the monk has returned to sweeping, oats swirling in lazy eddies. We make what we can, he says. We chew slowly. We pray faster. And so they did, for centuries, because when the pantry is empty of variety, it becomes full of intention. And sometimes, a well-packed satchel of oatcakes is all you need to cross a kingdom or outwait a storm. Section 4. You're heading uphill now, toward a windswept bluff above the abbey where the grass grows short and sheep are discouraged for fear they'll blow away. The monks call it St. Fintan's Seat. No one's quite sure if the saint actually sat there, but it's the kind of place that feels like it remembers something. Legend says this is where the biscuit miracle occurred. You arrive just as the sky begins to drizzle, not quite rain, but enough to make everything you own feel a little sticky. A small stone chapel sits at the hill's crest, flanked by two bent wooden benches, and a shrine that contains, supposedly, the relic of St. Fintan's original travel snack. The story goes like this. One foggy morning in the 7th century, St. Fintan was preparing for a journey across the island to deliver a sermon so long it had to be written on calfskin scrolls tied together with sheep gut and hope. Knowing he'd be walking for days, he asked the kitchen brothers for sustenance. They gave him the usual, a lump of oat bread, a pinch of salt, and a single dried crab apple, which he dutifully wrapped in cloth and packed away. But halfway into the journey, after fasting and prayer and possibly arguing with a confused badger, as many saints reportedly did, he found the cloth pouch oddly heavier. Inside, a small, warm biscuit, filled with honey, dried berries, and something that may have been crushed hazelnut. He ate it. He felt revived. He composed 3 extra psalms and claimed to see a beam of light from heaven resting on his feet. Word spread. The biscuit miracle became part of Abbey lore. Pilgrims came to visit the rock he rested on. A chunk of the original biscuit, a crumbling, suspiciously modern-looking scone, was placed in a glass box and given a place of quiet honor. No one's allowed to eat it, but every so often, someone opens the box and whispers a quick blessing, or a snack request. Historians still argue whether St. Fintan's story is apocryphal, metaphorical, or the result of a monk mixing up the relic jars. One skeptical chronicler suggested the miracle snack was just a well-timed breakfast. Another wrote, "Miracle or not, it inspired 3 new recipes and a pilgrimage path, so we keep it." You sit now beside the shrine. The mist thickens. The wind whistles through the chapel's cracked window. In your lap, a cloth-wrapped biscuit, oats, berries, a bit of apple. No miracle, but it'll do. You take a bite. It's simple, chewy, lightly sweet. The kind of food that doesn't distract you from prayer or walking, but doesn't punish you either. You chew slowly, watching the clouds roll by like saints with nowhere to be. Nearby, a small plaque reads, "He who travels hungry travels angrily." Share what you carry. A fitting motto, especially if your journey involves 5 days, 3 sermons, and at least 1 confused badger. The monks still bake Finton biscuits every year on the saint's day. They bless them, wrap them in wax paper, and hand them out with tiny handwritten notes. May this fill your road. May your crumbs find kind birds. You finish your biscuit, brush off the crumbs, and rise. The drizzle has stopped. The sea glints far below. And though you're no saint, you feel something settle in your belly, not just food, but a kind of quiet satisfaction. Because even if the story's made up, the feeling isn't. And sometimes, a biscuit really can be holy, especially if it gets you home. Section 5. You've come down from the bluff now, back to the abbey grounds, where the kitchen smells of damp ash and something vaguely yeasty. The monks are preparing what they call penitential loaves, also known as fasting bread, journeying bread, or, in one cheeky margin note, the chew of regret. These loaves are not here to impress you. They are dry, dense, and suspiciously beige, roughly the size of a fist and slightly harder. Their primary ingredients: ground barley, a touch of oat, and occasionally a smear of mashed beans for spiritual ballast. You pick one up. It has the weight of a small stone and the flexibility of none. A bite produces a modest crack. Somewhere across the kitchen, Brother Diarmuid nods solemnly. That's how you know it's humble. These loaves were made for one purpose: to sustain the body while afflicting the spirit. In the monastic logic of the time, travel was noble but dangerous. One could be tempted by comfort, by sin, by overly hospitable hosts offering cheese. And so, monks devised a food that nourished but did not delight. They called them viaticum panis, the bread for the road, though it was also known as the bread of minor discomfort, or, informally, clinker cake. You read through a small stack of waxy pages, kitchen records from the 9th century, likely copied in the 12th by a scribe who had feelings. One entry reads, "Loaves to be no larger than the palm, no softer than sandal leather, and no sweeter than boiled root." Another, more desperate, "Brother Cian added honey again. Abbot displeased. The bees are not for indulgence." Historians still argue whether these fasting loaves were truly effective at preserving piety, or just a creative way to make monks wish for shorter journeys. But it's clear that they played a role not just in nourishment, but in identity. To eat a penitential loaf was to remember who you were: a servant of the divine, a traveler on a narrow path, a man whose molars were likely aching from last week's sermon sandwich. These loaves were often paired with something equally ascetic, like pickled roots or dried nettles. Some monks carried tiny bottles of vinegar water to soften the bread en route. One record even mentions dipping loaf in holy spring, though no explanation is given as to whether this helped the flavor or the theology. You try another bite. It's less painful the second time, but not exactly better. The kind of chew that invites reflection, and possibly dental work. Still, there's a certain honesty in it. No false sweetness, no distracting texture, just grain, grind, and the quiet endurance of people who measured holiness in spoons of flour and minutes of mastication. You wander out into the cloister garden, loaf in hand, and find a bench warmed faintly by the afternoon sun. A robin eyes you, tilts its head, and wisely decides it's not worth the effort. In the corner of the garden is a stone with a carved inscription: "He who eats and forgets the way walks in circles. He who chews with reverence finds the path." It might be metaphor. It might be indigestion. You finish the loaf slowly, each bite a small act of faith or stubbornness. And as the wind picks up again, carrying the scent of crushed thyme and old parchment, you realize this wasn't just food. It was a reminder that even the journey of the faithful could use a little fiber. Section 6. The afternoon is long and quiet, stretched out like a cat in the sun. You find yourself back inside the Abbey scriptorium, a room so still you can hear the quills scratching. Rows of monks sit hunched at desks, copying psalms and saints' lives by candlelight, their eyes flickering between parchment and prayer. At first glance, it seems like the last place you'd find snacks. But listen closely. Every so often, there's a pause, a soft rustle, and a slow, deliberate chew. Yes, even here, monks were snacking. Not loudly, not with gusto, but in that solemn, contemplative way that turns eating into part of the work. Some called it masticatory meditation. Others, less formally, called it chewing the word. You take a seat at a low bench near a young monk bent over a copy of the Psalms. He has a small cloth-wrapped bundle beside his inkpot. When he senses your glance, he opens it. Inside, a crumbling slice of what appears to be dense fruit cake, oat, dried berries, maybe a hint of fennel. For memorization, he whispers, chewing helps the verses stick. It sounds ridiculous, but as it turns out, the monks may have been onto something. Some modern researchers believe chewing can aid cognitive retention. These monks didn't have EEGs or focus groups, but they had centuries of oral tradition and they understood rhythm. Repetition, the way the body reinforces the mind. And so, between stanzas, they nibbled. Historians still argue whether this was officially allowed or simply tolerated. One record from a stricter order describes distractions of the jaw and urges spiritual fast in both tongue and tooth. But most Irish communities were more forgiving. After all, if a dried apple wedge helped a brother remember the Beatitudes, who was going to object? The preferred snack for scriptorium work was simple, something soft enough not to crunch, sweet enough to offset monotony, and dry enough not to smear ink. Hence, the popularity of honeyed oat slices, pressed dried fruits, and what one abbot called quiet cakes. Some abbeys even had copying rations, small portions of nuts or preserved berries, doled out like communion. In one ledger, a particularly efficient scribe earned the rare reward of a slice of the preserved pear to be eaten between the books of kings. You watch as the monk takes a bite, chews slowly, and continues writing, Dominus illuminatio mea. The sunlight shifts across the stone walls. The flicker of candles is steady. A fly buzzes briefly, then thinks better of it. The room is still. Outside the scriptorium, in a corner alcove, you find a small jar filled with dried blackberries. A parchment note nearby reads, for the long verses, please do not hoard. Further along, a narrow shelf labeled, reserved for Lent, holds what look like biscuit pebbles, hard as bone, baked without joy. One is labeled psalm stones. You decide not to touch. You step outside as the bell tolls for none, the 9th hour. A few monks stretch, shake out their hands, and brush crumbs from their robes. One passes you with a slow smile and a raisin stuck in his beard. And you realize, again, that the divine doesn't always thunder from on high. Sometimes, it crinkles quietly in wax paper. Sometimes, it lingers on the roof of your mouth while you recite a particularly tricky line from Ezekiel. So if you ever need to remember something sacred, or simply stay awake through a long scroll, consider a quiet snack. Something humble, something chewy, something that reminds you that memory, like digestion, works best in peace. Section 7. Later that afternoon, you follow a cart path lined with mossy stones and low wooden markers, each one commemorating some small event the monks have deemed significant. Here Brother Fiacre lost his sandal, one says. Here the bees swarmed twice, says another. The next, here we moved the mill again. And that, as it happens, is where you're headed now, the Abbey Mill. It's a squat, round building perched beside a modest stream. The wheel turns slowly, rhythmically, like a sleepy heartbeat. Inside, everything is coated in a fine layer of oat dust, floor, beams, even the cat, who naps defiantly on a sack of barley. The scent is earthy, comforting, and a bit like a health food shop that takes its piety seriously. Every monastery needed a mill. Not just for self-sufficiency, but because grain didn't turn into anything edible without it. No flour, no cakes. No cakes, no snacks. And let's be honest, monks without snacks are just men in robes with too many rules. A monk named Brother Lorcan welcomes you with a puff of flour from his robe. He's the molendarius, or milk keeper, one of the most important jobs in the abbey, and arguably the messiest. This is where it all begins, he says, pointing to the heavy stones grinding oats into coarse meal. You want portable prayer food? You need patience and a sharp sieve. You nod, brushing a bit of flour off your sleeve. The noise inside is low but constant. Stone against stone, water against wheel, sack against shoulder. Monastic white noise. The mill turns slowly, steadily, processing sacks of local grain grown just outside the abbey walls. Barley is the workhorse. Oats, the everyday staple. Rye, rare but prized. Wheat, as always, nearly mythical. When a sack appears, it's treated like treasure. The flour isn't refined. That wasn't the point. Whole grain meant more fiber, more nourishment, more chew per prayer. Historians still argue whether monastic mills were symbols of control or charity. Some monasteries milled only for themselves. Others milled for local villages, charging in loaves or favors. One record from 888 AD notes that 3 days of milling earned 1 cheese and a warm cloak. Not a bad deal, honestly. You watch as Brother Lorcan scoops fresh oat flour into a large bowl. Today we're making travel wafers, he says. Good for 5 days, or 3 long sermons. He adds water and salt, mixes, kneads, flattens, then presses the dough onto a hot iron plate set near the fire. The result? A dry, flexible disc about the size of your hand. It smells faintly toasted, a little nutty. These stack well, he says. Don't go soft in the pouch. We used to make 100 before long walks. He hands you one, still warm. It tastes dependable. In a dusty corner, you find an old set of engraved plates, each bearing symbols. A fish, a Celtic knot, a simple cross. We press those into special wafers, Lorcan says. For pilgrims, sometimes just for fun. The fire crackles. The stones turn. Outside, birds chirp with complete disregard for the sacred mood. And for a moment, the whole world seems powered by flour and steam and faith. You sit on a sack of oats and eat your wafer slowly. It crumbles, just a little, but holds together well enough. There's something deeply comforting about food made this way. Honest, unhurried, designed not to delight but to endure. Because that's what mills are in the end. Not factories. Not factories. Foundations. They hum in the background, day after day, making the humble miracles possible. And if you listen long enough, you realize, even the grind can be holy. Section 8. Evening creeps in slow and soft, like a well-worn blanket. The sky dims to pewter, and the breeze picks up just enough to rustle the abbey's row of drying racks. Long wooden frames perched near the kitchen, draped with strips of cheesecloth and slats of woven reeds. This is where the real snack science happened. You've returned to the cloister's back garden, a space half kitchen, half experiment zone. Here, medieval monks practiced the arts of drying, smoking, salting, and occasionally fermenting whatever they had too much of. Preservation wasn't just a necessity, it was a minor miracle. A monk waves you over. He's tending to a tray of what look like shriveled fruit slices. Crab apples, he murmurs, as if you might get too excited. Sliced thin, soaked in cider, dried in the loft. You take one. It's leathery, tangy, surprisingly sweet. Possibly the world's first fruit leather. Next to him, a woven basket holds curls of root vegetable, mostly turnip, some parsnip, a few rebellious carrots. We salt them, he says, then dry them by the stove. For chewing, mostly. When you don't want to sin by asking for seconds. Chewing played a big role in monastic travel. Not eating, exactly, just occupying the mouth. Long walks, long silences, long sermons. A strip of dried turnip was the medieval monk's chewing gum, only with more theology and less flavor. Nearby, racks hold slabs of soft cheese coated in herbs and set to dry. Further along, strips of fish, flaked and salted. This one we don't eat unless we must, the monk admits. Tastes like penance. And hanging from one beam, tied neatly with red thread, are the prized items, honey-cured barley cakes. They glisten faintly in the firelight. Pilgrims take them to Glendalough, someone says. Good for 12 days, or until it rains. Historians still argue whether monks invented these preservation techniques or borrowed them from local farmers. The likely truth? A little of both. Irish monasteries were rarely isolated. They borrowed, traded, and copied whatever worked, then added prayer. In one kitchen ledger from the 11th century, a monk lists preserved items for winter travel: dried pear wedges, oat cakes layered, vinegar-soaked roots, herb balls for sore throats, berry mash to remind one of summer. You take one of the berry mashes now, really just crushed blackberries pressed into a wax-wrapped square. It's tart, sweet, melancholy, the kind of taste that whispers of August while you walk through sleet. The fire is stoked again. Smoke curls into the air. A monk adds more oatcakes to the shelf, humming softly. It's a tune without a name, half prayer, half lullaby. Not far away, another monk flips a cheese bundle, then writes something in chalk. Salted on Friday. Pray before slicing. You glance at a string of garlic knots hanging like charms. Against illness, someone says. Or visitors. You're not sure which was more feared. In the far corner, a rack holds a dozen tiny bags, personal snack bundles. Each one tagged with initials, weight and date. These are for outgoing monks. Some will travel by foot, some by boat. All will eat slowly, thankfully, and with more appreciation than we give most snacks today. And you, seated now beneath the beams, take one last bite of crabapple leather. The sky darkens. A bell tolls in the distance. And you think, here, in the quiet work of drying food and marking dates, lies a kind of gentle defiance. Against rot, against scarcity, against forgetting what's sweet in a season of lean. Because sometimes, holiness is just a berry, flattened and wrapped, waiting patiently for the road. Section 9. The morning is damp and golden as you walk toward the stables, not for horses, but for what the monks call pilgrimage beasts, a few stubborn donkeys and a handcart with one squeaky wheel. You're here to see what gets packed when a monk travels, not for trade, but for prayer. Today, Brother Eamon is preparing for a short journey to a neighboring abbey. It's only 20 miles, but in these days, that's a full day's walk. Maybe 2 if you stop to contemplate too many hedgerows. He's checking his pouch, and you get a peek at the contents. No money, no map, just a few essential items. First, 3 oatcakes, flat, dry, individually wrapped in linen squares. Second, 1 small waxed bundle of dried plum slices, faintly sticky. Third, a corked leather flask of diluted cider vinegar. For thirst, he says, or foot washing. Then there's the pouch of cheese, crumbly, rolled in ash, wrapped in nettle leaves to keep the flies off. Finally, the sacred snack, a honey loaf fragment wrapped in scriptural parchment. It's old, he admits, but the Psalms keep it fresh. You raise an eyebrow. He grins. Kidding. Mostly. Medieval Irish monks didn't travel empty-handed. Their faith demanded movement. Pilgrimages to sacred sites, visits to other monastic communities, journeys to retrieve relics or just share news. But the road was hard, wet, wild, and predictably lacking in roadside bakeries. So they invented the pilgrimage pouch. Not a fancy item, just a soft leather satchel worn under the robes close to the body. Some tied it with beads or stitches for luck. One monk even embroidered a fish into his, as a secret sign he was on God's business. Inside, the pouch held the bare minimum: food that wouldn't spoil, prayer beads, maybe a bone-handled spoon. Historians still argue whether these pouches were standardized or improvised. Some abbeys wrote guidelines. Others left it to the individual. But the basic rule was this: pack what nourishes and nothing more. 1 set of travel notes, half prayer, half checklist, reads: 2 days' food, 1 day's thanks, oilcloth for rain, 1 mercy for sharing. You watch Brother Eamon tuck a folded psalter into the top of his pack. Then he picks up a round of pilgrim bread, thicker than oat cake, scored with a cross. Hard as stone by the 3rd day, he says. But you can use it to knock sense into an argumentative herdsman. These snacks weren't just fuel. They were tools, symbols, sometimes even currency. A well-wrapped biscuit could be traded for shelter. A dried apple slice, shared at dusk, could mend a fraying friendship. Even the method of eating mattered. Monks didn't nibble idly. They stopped, Saturday, prayed, and chewed like it meant something, which, in their worldview, it did. As Eamon adjusts his cloak, he hands you a spare plum. For the way back, he says. Or if you need to forgive someone, you walk with him to the edge of the abbey grounds. He blesses the path with a quick sign, then sets off, feet sure, satchel bouncing gently, one oatcake already half crumbled from his pocket. You watch until he disappears behind the hazel trees. And standing there, holding a sticky plum slice in your hand, you realize that a journey doesn't need to be long to be sacred. It just needs intention, and maybe a good snack. Because in a world where miracles were rare and roads were rough, a pouch of oatcakes might be the holiest thing you carried. Section 10. Today begins with bees. You're in the Abbey's apiary, a tucked-away corner of the grounds where hives squat like overturned bread loaves, and the air hums with purpose. A monk in a thick veil is gently nudging a smoker near the entrance of a hive, and beside him sits a wooden crate filled with golden jars. Honey! Glorious, slow-moving, sunset-colored honey. The monks call it God's syrup, though not out loud, too cheeky. This is the source of sweetness in nearly every monk-made snack, from oat biscuits to cider-glazed fruit strips. Sugar was a luxury, a rare import from far-off lands. But honey was divine, domestic, and delicately distributed. The monk removes a comb and hands you a waxy sliver. It melts on your tongue like sunlight. Sweet, he says, but honest. Monks didn't just use honey for flavor. They used it for preservation, binding, and even healing. One old manuscript contains a list of uses. Sweeten bread, not spirit. Bind cakes, mend cuts. Cure throat, soothe fasting rage. Yes, fasting rage. It was real. Fasting was common, sometimes for penance, sometimes for discipline, often because they just ran out of cheese. During these long stretches of minimal meals, monks turned to small honey bites, just enough to keep one foot moving in front of the other. These meatless munchies, as one slightly rebellious brother called them, became a culinary genre, snacks that soothe but didn't spark indulgence. You find a basket in the kitchen labeled Lent loaves. They're small, round, made with crushed almonds and barley flour, then brushed lightly with honey and baked until hard. Perfect for pockets. Unimpressive in every way except endurance. Another basket holds grace cakes, tiny rounds made of dried pears and hazelnut paste, rolled in oats and drizzled with honey. Rare but cherished. Only for feast days, one monk says, or when someone finally finishes copying job. Historians still argue how strictly monks observe their sweet restrictions. Some orders banned honey outright during Lent. Others allowed it if used humbly. One scribe wrote, "I did not enjoy the cake, I merely absorbed it." Monastic loopholes were an art form. You step into the shade of a chestnut tree where two novices are carefully folding honeyed oat cakes into cloth. They're murmuring over the proper fold, as if origami determined salvation. One of them glances at you. If it leaks, the bees follow. Fair point. You sample one, dense, chewy, the sweetness slow and polite. The kind of snack that never shouts, only nods. Back in the herb garden, an elder monk recalls how they used to soak dried apples in honey water, then bake them into sun crisps, so called because they resemble the shape of the abbey's old rose window. They kept well, he says, and gave us something to look forward to. That was the heart of it, really. Honey was the abbey's optimism, a reward after silence, a softness after chewing barkroot biscuits for 6 days straight. You end the day by the apiary once more. The sun sets low, painting the hives in gold. A bee lands on your sleeve, considers you, then moves on. Probably not sweet enough. And in your pocket, one last grace cake waits. For later, for when the shadows stretch longer, for when you need to remember that joy, modest, measured, honeyed, was always allowed. Just not too much. Section 11. The sky is overcast, a soft lid on a quiet morning. Today you're shadowing Brother Muirish, the abbey's panis magistress, breadmaster, a role equal parts chef, steward, and passive-aggressive rule enforcer. He's tall, quiet, and carries a wooden paddle like a bishop's staff. You follow him into the bakery, a low stone room warmed by a single domed oven that radiates a comfort too sacred to interrupt. There's no fire now, just embers, and the smell, oh, the smell, is a heavenly mix of warm grain, smoke, and faintly singed linen. Breadmaster wasn't a ceremonial title. It was serious business. Feeding monks, especially those who walked, copied, prayed, and fasted, required discipline. And someone had to enforce the baking hierarchy. There was a strict order. Novices fetched water and wood. Mid-level monks ground, kneaded and shaped. Only the breadmaster loaded the oven, and no one touched the ashes without permission. You watch as Brother Mwirish inspects the loaves laid out on wooden boards. Some are basic round barley loaves. Others are flat oat cakes for travel. A few are scored with crosses, likely intended for feast days or dignitaries. He lifts one loaf, sniffs it, nods slightly, then tucks it back like a precious stone. There's a board on the wall with the baking schedule. Monday, oat cakes. Tuesday, barley rounds. Wednesday, vinegar rye, if any. Thursday, dried root rolls. Friday, fasting loaves, no joy permitted. Saturday, feast prep. Sunday, nothing, eat what's left. It's poetic in its bleakness. And yet, there's beauty here. Every loaf is the result of shared labor, prayer, and patience. The abbey had no yeast in the modern sense. Fermentation came from the air, the flour, and time. Some dough sat overnight. Some was blessed. All of it was watched, closely. You help a novice weigh a lump of barley dough. He kneads nervously, eyes flicking to Brother Mwirish. "Too wet?" he asks. The breadmaster doesn't answer. He just tilts his head, as if consulting the dough itself. Bread here was rationed. Each monk received a portion based on task, age, and health. Copyists got more. Gardeners more still. Those in punishment, just broth, and maybe a stale crust, if they were lucky. Historians still argue whether these hierarchies were fair or arbitrary, but they reveal much about how food mirrored structure. The abbey ran on obedience. And bread. You peek into a storage alcove where extra loaves rest in linen slings, tagged with initials. Personal reserves, allowed only with permission. One has BP etched on the crust. Brother Podrig, you assume. Next to it, someone scrawled a note. Your loaf sings at night. In the far corner, a clay jar holds crumbs, literally. Crumb bin, the novice says, for stew thickening. And penance. Apparently, monks caught sneaking extra bites were sometimes made to bake with only leftover crumbs. You help shape a few oat cakes, pressing the dough flat with the heel of your hand. A monk nearby traces a tiny fish into one, just before Brother Mwirish clears his throat meaningfully. No decoration on Thursdays. You eat your midday bread outside. Simple, still warm, smeared with a touch of butter the cook pretended not to have. You chew slowly, watching clouds scud over the distant hills. Because in the abbey, bread isn't background. It's the center. Baked, blessed, broken, remembered. And behind every perfect loaf stands a breadmaster in a soot-dusted robe, ensuring that the sacred ratio of grain, water, fire, and patience is never forgotten. Section 12. It's a blustery day, and you're on the move again, this time walking beside Brother Tuathal, one of the abbey's circuit monks. These were the monks who didn't stay tethered to a single cloister. Instead, they traveled, sometimes days, sometimes months, visiting smaller communities, bringing messages, relics, or the occasional rebuking sermon to a monastery that had perhaps grown a little too lax with its oat rationing. Brother Tuathal has walked this path many times. He wears the look of someone who prefers the rhythm of the road to the quiet of a chapel. And his bag, a marvel of monkish minimalism. He carries a walking stick, a thin psalter, and a pouch that, to your surprise, unfolds into a full travel kit. A flat loaf wrapped in beeswax cloth, a string of dried pear pieces, a tightly rolled square of sour oat paste, spoon optional, he says, and a mystery lump that he identifies as smoked cheese, aged 3 summers, and too strong for indoor prayer. These pocket meals weren't unique to Tuathal. Monks on the move had to be clever. Most roads offered no inns, no bakeries, and no guarantee that the next monastery would be particularly generous. Travel snacks had to be light, long-lasting, and edible with cold fingers on a rainy hill. You stop under a tree to rest. Tuathal unwraps a tiny parcel from linen. Inside is a biscuit unlike any you've seen. Half-sphere, dark and dense, with visible seeds. Hunger stone, he calls it. Chew slowly. It fights back. You try it. It's aggressively neutral, but oddly comforting. The seeds give it a crunch. The texture invites thought. It's not meant to be finished quickly, he says. Like prayer. or frost. Historians still argue whether these snacks were standardized or crafted by each abbey. Some records list exact measurements for travel biscuits. Others are more poetic. No heavier than hope. No sweeter than truth. To Athel shares stories as you walk. A time his oat bundle froze solid and became a blunt instrument for fending off a goat. Another time he traded a half-wheel of cheese for shelter with a particularly grumpy hermit who only agreed after smelling the rind. Some monks added prayers to their food wrappers. Others carved messages into the crust of their loaves. Tuathal once received a biscuit stamped with a verse. Though you walk in shadow, chew with purpose. He kept the crust in his cloak for years, eventually using it to plug a hole in the roof of a remote cell. You reach a small glen where Tuathal builds a tiny fire, just enough to warm the cheese lump. Too dangerous cold, he says with a wink. Cacaw's visions. The meal is modest. Warm cheese, oat flat, a few pear pieces. You eat slowly, sitting on a mossy stone as birds argue above. There's no rush. Every bite feels like it's being counted by the trees. These pocket meals weren't glamorous, but they were perfect in their way. Portable, nourishing, humble. They turned a solitary journey into something shared. A taste from home. A promise that someone had thought ahead. That someone believed your road mattered. As the fire dims, Tuathal stands, shakes out his cloak, and repacks his pouch with the same quiet care as before. He nods once toward you. Want another hunger stone? You accept. You'll need it. Not because you're hungry, but because now you understand. Some roads are meant to be walked slowly. And some snacks, if chewed just right, can lead you somewhere sacred. Section 13. The wind has settled, and the abbey is quiet, but the kitchen is not. You're back inside the stone-walled warmth, where Brother Malachi is preparing what can only be described as a gift basket. It's not wrapped in ribbons or delivered with a flourish, but make no mistake, this is monastic diplomacy at its tastiest. The intended recipient, a local chieftain known to be temperamental, but fond of hazelnuts. In a world without email, postage, or agreeable horses, food was the message. And monks, being ever practical, often used their snacks as emissaries. Today's basket includes a small round of herb-rubbed cheese, a sealed jar of cider-infused dried apples, 6 oatcakes scored with a cross, and a small barley loaf with a faintly humorous poem scratched into the crust. This one's for goodwill, Malachi says. The last batch we sent was too salty. Diplomatically and literally. Food diplomacy wasn't an accident. In a landscape dotted with rival tribes, hungry travelers, and roving bishops, monasteries became neutral ground. A well-timed fruitcake could soothe tensions. A cheese wheel might settle a boundary dispute. A basket of honey biscuits delivered on a saint's feast day. A guaranteed conversation starter. You look through a stack of old ledgers nearby, records of gifts given and received. Some are simple. 2 loaves to Brother Seamus of the East Hill. Others are more intriguing. 4 honeyed roots and a note of apology to Lady Bridget, delayed due to fox-related incident. Historians still argue whether these exchanges were transactional or genuinely generous. Probably both. Monks were known for charity, but also for survival. And what better way to build a buffer against raiding neighbors than by feeding them nicely? There are tales of entire conflicts avoided through snack diplomacy. One chronicle describes how a dispute over a crumbling boundary wall was halted mid-argument when one party shared a fig-studded barley cake. Another story, possibly apocryphal, claims that an abbot once defused a Viking encounter by offering smoked goat wrapped in linen with a note that read, "Better shared than burned." You watch as the basket is carefully wrapped in cloth. The cheese is nestled like a jewel. The loaf, lightly perfumed with fennel, is tucked beside it. A final touch, a small wooden spoon, carved with the abbey's symbol, a fish wrapped in vines. Just enough to remind the chieftain who baked his snacks. Outside, a messenger monk prepares his cloak. He's not riding. He'll walk. Slowly, carefully, avoiding muddy spots, carrying not only food, but favor. He nods to you. This bread may save us a sermon. As he leaves, you glance at the leftover scraps. Trimmed ends of oat cake, slivers of pear, a bit of fake paste stuck to the work table. Brother Malachi sees you looking. We eat what they don't, he says with a grin. Sometimes we get the better end. And maybe he's right. Because when you break bread with someone, even if it's oat-based, twice-baked, and spiritually chewy, you open something more than a mouth. You open a door. So the next time you're tempted to write a sharp letter, pause. Bake something instead. You never know what a biscuit might fix. Section 14. This evening, you're back inside the quiet of the monk's sleeping hall, rows of wooden cots, each with a folded robe, a prayer book, and more often than not, a little linen pouch tucked under the straw mattress. What's inside? Snacks. Hidden ones. Despite all the rules, the fasting hours, and the liturgical schedules, monks were still human. And humans, being humans, get hungry after dark. So it should come as no surprise that even in the most disciplined of abbeys, there existed a practice known unofficially as cloister hoarding. You watch as Brother Aegon, long past his novice years, sneaks a quick nibble of something under his blanket. You cough politely. He jumps a little, then smiles. "Don't worry," he whispers. "It's barley peel. Spiritually neutral." The monks weren't gluttons. But when meals were small and fasts were long, tucking away a bit of dried apple or a sliver of oatcake for later became common, if quietly discouraged. Some even framed it theologically, storing the seed for the journey. Others just didn't want to wake up starving. You peek inside one such linen pouch. It contains 2 barley biscuits, slightly stale, 1 flattened date, a tiny wooden spoon, and, oddly, a single dried mint leaf. This was someone's emergency stash. Not luxurious, but familiar. Like a comfort item you could chew. One monk tells you he always keeps a crumb portion just in case of extra-long vigils. Another admits he once bartered a fake sliver for someone's turn at bell duty. A fair trade, he insists. Historians still argue whether this hoarding was officially punished or quietly permitted. Most rules mention gluttony, but few get specific. One abbey added a clause forbidding private nibbling in the dark. Another allowed small reserves for monks of weak constitution, which covered a wide range of self-diagnosed cases. You notice a small wooden box hidden behind a support beam. Inside, layered oat crisps, pressed flat and labeled by week. Some are decades old. Relics, you ask. Snack archive, says Brother Amen. To see what lasts. Not everything lasted. Dried turnip strips went out of fashion after too many monks broke teeth. Pickled barley balls were phased out for being too damp to trust. But dried fruit and oat cakes, always there, always hidden, always a bit forbidden. There's a kind of monkish rebellion in the practice. Not loud, not defiant, just a small act of softness against an often rigid world. A whisper that says, even the devout deserve a midnight crumb. As the hall settles into stillness, you hear the faintest crack, someone nibbling a hard biscuit in the dark. No judgment here, only solidarity. Because in a life ruled by bells and schedules and silence, a secret snack is more than sustenance. It's a reminder that the body still matters, that comfort has a place, even if it's folded into a sock or tucked into straw. And when morning comes, and the bell rings, and the oat gruel appears once again in the same cracked bowls, well, the hidden biscuit will still be there, waiting, witnessing, ready. Section 15. There's a gentle clatter from the scriptorium this morning. Not the sound of falling ink pots or dropped parchment, but something more edible. You follow your nose and your curiosity to find a peculiar sight. A table covered in half-written manuscripts, one monk humming softly, and several steaming trays of barley scones. Break time, says Brother Tigarnak, wiping flour from his fingers. We pause between prophets. You're witnessing a practice as old as the ink on the walls, boredom baking. Copying manuscripts was noble, vital, and, let's be honest, exhausting. Hours spent hunched over vellum, squinting at fading Latin, required frequent breaks. And when monks weren't napping or walking the cloister path, they sometimes turned to the kitchen for relief. That's how spoon-making became, unofficially, the abbey's second favorite spiritual activity. You roll up your sleeves, figuratively, since your robe is already short, and join the work. The dough is humble, barley flour, a little dried milk, chopped dried pear, and a touch of wild honey. No yeast, just effort. Brother Tigarnak hands you a wooden mold. We press the scones flat, he says, so they don't rise up with pride. You think he's joking. He is not. The baking is simple. A flat stone near the hearth, coals raked gently to one side, scones set in a ring like monks at prayer. While they bake, you look over a pile of half-finished manuscripts. Many have notes in the margins, not theological commentary, but recipes. One lists 5 scone variants. Lent scone, no joy. Harvest scone with nuts. Quiet scone, extra dry. Pilgrim scone, wrap in wax cloth. Festal scone, serve with apples once a year. Historians still argue whether monks were allowed to bake recreationally. Some abbeys banned it during Lent. Others encouraged bread breaks to keep scribes from dozing into the Gospel of Luke. One rulebook simply says, "If idle hands must stir, let them stir flour." You check the scones. They're browned at the edges and smell faintly of roasted oat and hope. One monk gently taps the crust of his like a tambourine before eating it. "If it sings, it's ready," he says. You bite into yours. It's dry, chewy, slightly sweet. The kind of thing that doesn't distract you from spiritual tasks, but also doesn't make you resent existence. Brother Tygarnak pulls a scroll from a cubbyhole and holds it up. "This psalm was copied entirely during scone intervals," he says. You can tell from the crumbs. Indeed, the margins are speckled with ancient flecks. Oats, ash, divine mysteries. Outside, the rain starts again. You hear it tapping against the roof like fingers, drumming a rhythm only the saints would understand. You sip warm cider and eat your second scone, just as humble as the first, but now familiar. And you begin to understand. In a world ruled by silence, repetition, and reverence, boredom was inevitable. But it wasn't shameful. It was an invitation to stir something, to shape something, to turn restlessness into sustenance. The monks knew this. And while they may never have called it self-care, they practiced it all the same, one barley scone at a time. Section 16. It's Sunday, or at least, what passes for Sunday here, quiet, structured, just a little softer than the other days. The abbey moves more slowly, the bells ring a fraction more gently, and the air smells faintly of cheese and fresh bread. You find yourself seated at one of the long wooden tables in the refectory, flanked by rows of silent monks. Each place setting is identical. One clay bowl, one wooden spoon, one folded cloth napkin, and one round of barley cheese bread, warm and gently cracked at the top. This is not a feast, but it is a moment of comfort. Brother Saulan walks the rows with a small pot of herbs and oil, drizzling a few drops onto each loaf. Not enough to cause envy, just enough to soften the crust. Then comes the bell, not the clang of alarm or call to prayer, but a wooden clapper rung twice. This is the silent meal bell, a signal that says, "Eat mindfully, chew slowly, and don't speak unless the cheese catches in your throat." The first bite is warm, dense, and nutty. The bread is mixed with soft goat cheese, a little wild garlic, and just enough salt to taste intentional. It's designed to be eaten quietly. No crunch, no slurp, just a slow dissolve of labor and care. You glance around. No one looks up. The monks eat in synchronized solitude, their hands steady, their expressions calm. One of them closes his eyes after each bite, as if he's listening to the bread. This daily meal is known in some circles as the hour of chew. Not officially, of course, but among monks, the rhythm of the meal became a form of meditation. Some abbeys added little touches. One community served cheese in spiral cuts to encourage contemplation. Another placed a single herb leaf under the bread. Always a surprise, always edible. Mint for clarity, sage for memory, nettle for humility. You find your herb leaf. It's time. Fitting. Historians still argue how much variation existed between abbeys and meal rituals. Some served the same loaf every day. Others rotated modestly based on season, supply, or weather. One ledger includes this entry: rain for 4 days, root stew rejected, cheese bread returned to favor. That root stew, you're told, had a reputation. A penance with a spoon, one monk whispers later, breaking the silence by accident and earning a look. Back in the refectory, the meal continues. A second bell rings. A novice rises and reads from a scroll, not scripture this time, but a list of weekly baking tasks and one brief story about a monk who allegedly invented spiced oat bars using only prayer and stubbornness. The monks smile faintly. That story's a favorite. Even in silence, it gets a chuckle. The final bite of your bread is the best. It's cooled slightly, more chewy than crumbly. The cheese is settled into the grain like memory into old stone. And as you finish, wiping your fingers on your cloth, you feel something settle, not just fullness but calm. The kind of fullness that doesn't end with food, but continues in quietness. Because in the Abbey, meals weren't just for nourishment. They were a return to rhythm, a collective exhale, a reminder that you didn't have to speak to feel fed. You rise with the others, file out into the cloister, and listen as the wooden clapper sounds again. One note, one beat, and the monks disperse like dandelion seeds, each one moving with the patience of someone whose belly and spirit has been gently, quietly, completely satisfied. Section 17. You're up early, earlier than usual. The sun hasn't cracked the edge of the hills yet, and the Abbey feels like it's still asleep, wrapped in mist and breath. Today marks the beginning of Lent, and the shift is immediate. Gone are the cheese loaves. Gone are the honeyed fruits, the midday figs, the softly murmured exceptions. This is the season of restraint, but within that restraint, something curious blooms, creativity. You find yourself in the kitchen again, where the brothers are gathered around the hearth, not to feast, but to improvise. What they're making is not quite bread, not quite porridge, not quite punishment. It's somewhere between, and it's what they call Lenten cakes. The ingredients are humble, bordering on monastic cliché: barley flour, mashed turnip, a few dried nettles, and salt. No dairy, no eggs, no sweetness, just intention. You watch as Brother Setna shapes the mixture into small, round patties. He presses one flat with a wooden board etched faintly with a sunburst, ornamentation not for vanity, but for symbolism. To remember what's returning, he explains. The patties are laid near the coals, not in the oven. Lent is about small heat, small steps. They bake slowly, steaming more than sizzling, and the scent is honest. When they're done, you take one. It's firm, slightly spongy, and faintly green from the nettle. You bite in. It tastes like nothing, or maybe like everything, stripped down. This is boredom baking at its peak. And yet, it's also a kind of culinary meditation. The monks get inventive. One adds crushed wild garlic to his batch. Another rolls his in oat dust for texture. Someone carves a small fish into the top, symbolic, edible, quietly defiant. Historians still argue how strictly Lenten restrictions were followed in different abbeys. Some communities banned even herbs. Others allowed a weekly joy morsel, a single bite of something forbidden, rationed like grace. One record notes, Brother Aidan permitted a honey smear on the 27th day due to excessive dreaming of pears. You're handed a Lenten loaf next. This one's longer, drier, made from sour oat and cider vinegar. The monks call it the slipper, because once a novice threw one in frustration, and it landed in the abbot's shoe. The name stuck. So did the shoe. Despite the limitations, the mood isn't dour. There's laughter, quiet jokes, an unspoken sense of camaraderie in the austerity. You realize that for these monks, boredom wasn't something to be avoided. It was part of the season, an invitation to notice what you never do when cheese is on the table. They bake slowly. They chew slowly. They reflect. You sit outside near the herb garden, holding your Lenten cake like it's a message. A bird hops close. You offer a crumb. It declines politely. Inside, Brother Setna is humming again, shaping another batch. He smiles. The secret to Lent, he says, is remembering it ends. And when it does, butter tastes like heaven. You smile too, chewing the nettle bread, and realize it's not so bad. Not because it's delicious, but because it's real. And in a life of sacred repetition, reality, however dry, however herb-flecked, is something worth baking for. Section 18. The Abbey's guest house is quiet today, its stone benches warmed faintly by a late morning sun. You're seated beside a traveler, a thin man in faded robes, halfway through a long journey that's left his boots scuffed and his patience in tatters. He's here with a question. Do you have any of those old Celtic crossbuns? You pause. You've never heard of such a thing. He insists. You know, the ones the monks used to bless and bury under oak trees to keep the Vikings away? That doesn't sound quite right. And just like that, you're plunged into the curious world of invented traditions. The monks here, practical and polite, obliged the guest with something close, an oat cake stamped with a small cross, served warm with berry mash. He seems satisfied, even inspired. But after he leaves, Brother Cormac leans toward you and murmurs, "We've never buried a bun in our lives." You've entered the realm of monk snack myths. Over the centuries, travelers, tourists, and well-meaning chroniclers have added layers of folklore to monastic cuisine. Some are charming, some are dubious. All reveal something about how we romanticize the past, even its snacks. Take the tale of the St. Bridget's butter biscuit, said to be blessed to last 100 years without spoiling. Records show it likely originated in a 19th century pub during a butter shortage. Or the Abbey jelly loaf, supposedly made with fermented gooseberries and consumed only during lunar eclipses. Entirely fictional, though someone did try to recreate it in 1987 with regrettable consequences. Historians still argue how these myths took hold. Some blame overzealous Victorian historians. Others point to 20th century tourist guides looking to spice up stone ruins. One pamphlet from 1923 claims that monks invented the sandwich during a vision of St. Luke. Completely untrue, but catchy. Even monks sometimes played along. In one ledger, a monk records baking St. Mirren's patience pie for a bishop's visit. The pie, he notes, was imagined entirely but received warmly. Another scribbled joke in a margin reads, "Serve the relic loaf with jam. Tell them it's from Jerusalem." You walk through the Abbey kitchen side chamber, a place where old molds and bread stamps are stored. One resembles a Celtic knot. Another, a sunburst. One, puzzlingly, has a duck wearing a halo. "That one's a joke," says Brother Saulan. Or a warning. You come across a recipe labeled spring cross cake. It's dated vaguely and includes instructions like bake until the scent is hopeful and serve only if the lambs bleat thrice. You suspect it began as a teaching tool or a prank. Still, something about these fictions sticks. Even when they aren't true, they feel like they could be. The Abbey itself seems to agree. They've started a tradition of letting guests invent their own snack legends, which are dutifully recorded in a leather-bound book called Crumbs of Imagination. One entry, the buttered salter, a loaf that whispers scripture when sliced. Another, the apostle biscuit, contains exactly 12 raisins. Always, you add your own before leaving. The wandering loaf, if you lose it on the road, it returns at dusk. Back outside, the Abbey bells ring gently. The visitor is gone, his cross bun presumably enjoyed. And the monks, they're laughing over tea and bread, delighting in how the past grows stranger with each retelling. Because maybe some myths are worth keeping, if only to remind us that memory, like dough, rises best when warmed with a little imagination. Section 19. The Abbey garden is in full till today, cabbages slumping with age, leeks standing like quiet sentinels, and turnips, so very many turnips. You didn't think anything could look smug, but one particularly knobby specimen seems to glare at you like it knows what's coming. You've arrived just in time for Root Stew Day. A tradition, a necessity, and depending on who you ask, a weekly penance disguised as nutrition. You sit near the kitchen fire where Brother Fergal is stirring a pot large enough to baptize someone in. He lifts the lid, and a waft of turnip-scented steam hits you like a theological crisis. "She's thick today," he says proudly. "Very spiritual." Root stew was the Abbey fallback when supplies were low, creativity was gone, and Len had settled in like an unwelcome guest. Turnips, parsnips, and the occasional surprise radish, chopped, boiled, salted lightly, and served with the solemnity of a sermon. You try a spoonful. It tastes like resignation with a hint of earth. Not bad exactly, just aggressively beige in flavor. The kind of meal that says, "You're alive and that's enough." Monks weren't immune to complaints. One margin note in a kitchen ledger reads, "No more purple roots, please. They stain the soul." Another, "Add herbs." Even penitents have tongues. Still, root stew had its defenders. It was filling, dependable, and ideal for long days of copying or fasting. Some monks even claimed it sharpened their scripture recall. "Nothing like a bland bowl to focus the mind," one abbot wrote. Historians still argue whether these stews had nutritional depth or were simply warm ballast. Most agree that the roots were chosen for survival, not delight. They grew easily. stored well, and didn't protest when thrown into boiling water. You watch Brother Fergal ladle the stew into bowls, each portion identical, each monk receiving it with the same blank expression, a mix of gratitude and quiet dread. A few add crusts of barley bread to soak up the flavor. One adds a handful of dried mint. A tiny rebellion. Occasionally, someone tries to innovate. Brother Alton once tried roasting the turnips before boiling them. It caused brief confusion and a strongly worded scroll. Too tasty, the note read. Breeds pride. In the courtyard, an old monk tells you a story. Once, during a particularly harsh winter, the abbey survived almost entirely on root stew and oat cakes. We started naming the turnips, he says. Geraldine was a delight. The stew changed slightly by region. Inland abbeys used more parsnip. Coastal ones added seaweed or dried fish, which helped with flavor but confused the symbolism. One abbey in the north tried adding goat milk, but the results were described simply as unwise. You finish your bowl slowly, chewing with the focus of someone reciting internal psalms to stay awake. And yet, there's a strange peace in it. The consistency, the humility, the sense that this is what monks have eaten for centuries, reliably dull, modestly nourishing, quietly binding. Brother Fergal joins you with a second bowl. What more? He asks. You look like someone who needs grounding. You accept, because in this place, even stew is a lesson. That not every meal needs to excite. Some meals just hold you in place, remind you you're part of something older, rooted, if you will. And as you finish, you tip your bowl and murmur the traditional phrase, "May the roots keep rising." Not tasty, but timeless. Section 20. The Abbey Library is colder than you expect. Not unfriendly, just stone cold, literally. Scrolls are bundled like sleeping monks, and the air smells of dried ink, beeswax, and just the faintest whiff of very old fruit. You're here to see a relic, not a bone, not a robe, but a snack. A very old snack. Brother Manus meets you with a soft grin and a brass key. He opens a tall wooden cabinet marked Items of Moderate Wonder. Inside, glass boxes, parchment tags, and in the center, nestled on a square of faded blue linen, what appears to be a raisin cake. It is small, flat, slightly misshapen, brown with time, but still recognizably cake-shaped. The tag reads, Raisin Cake, Year of Our Lord 988. Made by Brother Angus for the Feast of St. Blathmac. Misplaced during inventory. Rediscovered behind Salter Shelf, 1043. The story is as follows. Brother Angus had been tasked with baking for a minor feast, something celebratory, but not extravagant. He crafted a batch of oat and raisin cakes, sweetened with wild honey, and set them in the chapel kitchen to cool. Then came the summons, a sudden sermon delivery to the orchard workers. In his haste, Angus tucked the cakes away for safekeeping. Unfortunately, safekeeping meant a narrow crevice behind the scripture shelf. There, one cake slipped, wedged into a hollow, and was promptly forgotten for 55 years. When it was found, it had hardened into something approaching fossil. A scribe noted it, smelled faintly of sanctity and disappointment. Rather than discard it, the monks decided to enshrine it. Today, it's known as the relic of the raisin cake. Historians still argue whether the cake was ever truly edible or if it began as a failed batch elevated by myth. One record notes it had too much bark, possibly referring to a mistaken addition of tree scrapings instead of cinnamon. Still, it became an object of interest. Pilgrims came to see it. One even claimed a vision of St. Bridget after gazing at it too long. A second visitor tried to eat it, broke a tooth, and declared it unyielding as sin. The monks built a tiny stand for it, wrote a hymn. Every year on the same feast day, they place a fresh raisin cake beside the relic, in conversation, as they put it. Sometimes they leave a small spoon, just for whimsy. You're handed a replica to try. It's crumbly, sweet, and studded with raisins soaked in mead. Not exactly divine, but comforting. We updated the recipe, says Brother Manus. Less bark, more raisin. The original cake, of course, remains untouched. A reminder that even snacks can achieve immortality if misplaced correctly and surrounded by enough curious reverence. As you leave the library, a novice scribbles a label for a newer item. Apple sliver, possibly eaten by Abbot Tig, 1121. Currently speculative, you realize that here, time itself is preserved in crumbs. That food, humble and perishable, becomes sacred not through flavor, but through memory. And a good story. So next time you lose a cookie behind the couch, maybe give it a century. It might just become a relic. Section 21. It's well past midnight now, and the wind is howling like a choir that's lost the melody. You're tucked into a corner of the abbey's kitchen, huddled near the hearth with 3 monks and a candle that refuses to stop flickering. You're here for a story, a strange one. It begins with a biscuit. The year was 842 AD. The place, this very abbey. The occasion, a feast day disrupted by the sudden arrival of Viking raiders. Longships slicing through the mist like sharp thoughts, full of men who did not come for the scones. Most of the monks fled. A few stood their ground. And one, Brother Killian, stayed behind to rescue what he believed was important. A tiny reliquary, 2 scrolls, and 1 still warm honey oat biscuit from the morning bake. The scrolls were lost. The reliquary was taken. But the biscuit? It survived. According to legend, Killian hid in a root cellar for 3 days, living off that single biscuit. When he emerged, the abbey was scorched, the altar blackened, but the biscuit was only slightly stale. What happened next is stranger. Killian buried the biscuit near the base of the chapel's old stone cross. Decades later, when the abbey was rebuilt, monks unearthed a tiny oilskin-wrapped parcel. Inside, a biscuit, untouched, wrapped in a note that read simply, "He fed me well." Whether he referred to God, the biscuit, or both remains unclear. Historians still argue whether this event occurred at all. Some point to inconsistencies in the dates. Others claim the story is a symbolic retelling of spiritual endurance. But the fact remains, a small, petrified biscuit, now housed in a glass box marked "no longer edible," sits in the sacristy archive. You're shown a replica. It's dense, oat-heavy, and slightly triangular. Designed to fit in a pocket or under stress, the current baker jokes. You take a bite. It holds together better than expected. Chewy, just sweet enough, with a faint taste of smoke. Some say Brother Killian's biscuit had divine properties, that it resisted rot, soothed the heart, and even discouraged raiders. One monk insists it once bounced off a Viking's helmet and bought enough time for 2 novices to escape. The biscuit of boldness, he calls it. Others think it's all just allegory. Bread as body, sugar as spirit, biscuit as beacon. But the abbey keeps the story alive. Each year, on the feast of St. Killian, unofficial, unsanctioned, the monks bake replicas of the biscuit and hand them out to visitors. The rules are clear. Eat it only when needed. Don't add butter. It didn't have butter in 842. And if it saves your life, please write it down. You sit near the embers, cradling your half-eaten biscuit and listening to the wind. The kitchen settles. A spoon clinks softly in the sink. Somewhere, a shutter bangs once, then stops. And for a moment, you can almost believe the biscuit was a miracle. Or at least, a very determined snack. One that knew when to hold fast, when to keep its shape, and when to wait, silently, for the world to crumble and rebuild around it. Because sometimes, survival is its own form of holiness, especially when wrapped in oilskin. Section 22. You're walking near the garden wall now, past the cabbage beds and the sleepy compost heap, when you spot something curious. A low stone ledge, neatly arranged with a line of small bundles, cloth-wrapped, tightly tied, each one the size of a clenched fist. It's not laundry. It's not lost. It's snacks. Forbidden ones. This is the midnight stash, a quiet tradition that no rulebook officially acknowledges, but every monk knows. These are late-night nibbles, emergency bites, quiet comforts for those hours after Vespers, when the body remembers it has a belly and the heart remembers it has a craving. You glance around. No one stops you as you sit on the wall's edge. Brother Eunan appears, walking slowly, hands behind his back. He notices your interest. Some monks eat, he says. Some confess. Some do both. He unties one bundle and reveals a square of dried oat and berry paste, hardened at the edges but still faintly fragrant. A night cake, he explains. We make them from kitchen leftovers. Fruit ends, old barley mash, dust of bread. These are not elaborate treats. They are practical, chewy, durable, a little sweet, but not enough to tempt envy. And they are almost always eaten in hiding. Technically, food after evening prayer was discouraged, except in illness, travel, or celebration. But the lines were blurry. One monk once described his midnight cheese as emotional medicine. Another wrote, "If my hands sin with butter, let it be unto peace." Historians still argue whether these nighttime snacks were tolerated or quietly ignored. Some abbots cracked down. Others simply asked monks to clean the cloths without asking what had been inside. You walk along the garden path. In the shade of the wall, someone has carved a tiny message. Bread in the dark is still light. At the base of the message, a tiny wax wrapper. Empty. One particularly clever novice invented a ritual called the Watcher's Bite, leaving a wrapped snack on a windowsill for anyone praying after hours. They weren't always taken, but when they were, the next morning brought a new one. Quiet generosity, wrapped in linen. Tonight, Brother Yunan hands you a packet of your own. It's cool in your hands, soft at the corners. Inside, a small slice of vinegar apple bread wrapped with a mint leaf. For sleep, he says, or reflection, or both. You sit beneath a fig tree that hasn't borne fruit in years. The stars are bright enough to read your own fingers. You take a bite. The taste is gentle, slightly tart, completely soothing. You chew slowly, letting the silence settle around you. Far off, someone coughs. A bell chimes once, not for time, but for memory. Because what these snacks offered wasn't just sustenance. It was permission, a quiet agreement between body and soul that hunger could be heard and answered without guilt. You finish the slice, fold the wrapper, and tuck it into the wall. Maybe someone else will find it. Maybe it will stay there, a little relic of reassurance. And as you rise, you feel full, not of food, exactly, but of calm, of warmth, of the knowledge that even here, behind garden walls and beneath silent stars, someone cared enough to bake for your shadow. Section 23. Dawn comes slow and golden. You're walking now through the oldest part of the abbey, past crumbling walls no longer patched, worn statues of saints whose names no one remembers, and into a small round room known as the baking cell. It's quiet, empty, but not abandoned. This is where it began. The first oven, the first loaves, the first whispered prayers offered over flour and water and hope. You kneel beside the hearth and run your fingers over grooves worn into the stone by centuries of kneading. The room still smells faintly of ash and something warm. Brother Donchad joins you, holding a basket of barley flour and a small book wrapped in oilcloth. "This is where we come," he says, "when we need to remember how to begin again." He means baking, but he also means life. Snack making here was never just a chore. It was soul work. You flip through the book he's brought. Inside are hand-copied notes from monks long gone. Most aren't recipes. They're reflections. Oats are humble. So should I be. This bread rose. May I do the same? I stirred in silence today. The silence fed me. Some entries are practical. One outlines a ritual for blessing flour before a journey. Another details a fasting loaf meant for mourners. Bland, dense, meant to be eaten with tears. But others are almost lyrical. The crumb was tender. I saw God in it. Historians still argue whether this blending of labor and liturgy was formalized or spontaneous. Some abbeys had official baking prayers. Others simply knew that kneading was its own kind of devotion. You help Brother Donchad prepare a new batch, Lenten travel cakes. The dough is stiff. You knead slowly, rhythmically, palms pressing as he murmurs a psalm under his breath. It feels less like baking, more like breathing. Each cake is shaped by hand, no molds. Uniformity is for armies, he says. We're pilgrims. He presses a thumbprint into each one, a personal mark. Not ownership, but presence. They bake in silence. You sip warm water steeped with dried sage, watching the coals shift color. Outside, the wind moves gently through the trees. No bells, no chores, just warmth, intention, grain turning to grace. When the cakes are done, you try one. It's coarse, unsweetened, but satisfying. You chew slowly, knowing each bite carries the memory of hands before yours, of monks who lived, prayed, wept, and baked in this very space. Brother Donchad opens a small drawer and pulls out a relic of sorts, a charred corner of an ancient loaf, preserved in wax and reverence. "Burnt during a storm," he says. "We kept it anyway. Proof that even ruined bread can feed someone. You tuck that lesson away. Because what these monks did, what they still do, is more than preserve recipes. They preserved ritual. They turned barley into rhythm, dough into meaning, silence into taste. You walk back into the daylight carrying a satchel of the new loaves. They're not beautiful. They weren't meant to be. But they're sacred, not because of what's in them, but because of how they were made. With care, with stillness, with a prayer in every fold." Section 24. Late afternoon. The abbey is quiet, almost expectant. You're seated in the outer courtyard near a low stone wall etched with years of rain, fingertips tracing names and notches worn by hands long gone. And then, without fanfare or warning, it happens. The arrival of the cheese wheel. It comes once a month, carried in with solemnity by 2 monks from the neighboring valley. It's not huge, but it's hefty, wrapped in waxed cloth, bearing a faint, righteous smell of patience and ambition. It's a wheel of goat cheese, a real one. The effect on the kitchen is immediate. Monks appear like well-trained cats, pretending to pass through casually. Brother Yunan coughs near the stairs. Twice. No one reacts. But the kitchen knows. Cheese was a treasure, especially aged cheese, especially round cheese. It was shared rarely, save for feast days, visitors of importance, or moments when morale had quietly hit the floor. But then came the time the abbot banned it. The incident began, unsurprisingly, with enthusiasm. The cheese wheel was unwrapped too early, too eagerly. Brother Fintan, who had never been subtle, sliced into it before the vespers bell. Others followed. By the time the official meal began, only rind and shame remained. Thus the decree: no wheels, only wedges, only slices, nothing round. Too tempting, the abbot had written. Encourages excess, breeds urgency. Historians still argue whether this event occurred as described. The earliest reference to the wheel incident appears in a margin scribbled beside a list of stolen turnips. But oral tradition is clear. For one entire season, the abbey was de-wheelified. Cheese, of course, returned. Quietly, first in cubes, then in flat rounds passed off as coin loaves. Eventually, one wheel was smuggled in under the guise of being a dense, firm pudding. You bite into a slice from the current wheel, aged with herbs, slightly crumbly, sharp in a way that makes your eyebrows lift. It's the kind of cheese that makes barley bread feel like royalty. Brother Fintan, now older and visibly unrepentant, passes by and murmurs, "They never caught me with the second one." You eat another bite. The abbot who banned cheese wheels has long since passed. A small wooden plaque in the kitchen now reads, "Let the wheel turn, but slice it well." You help distribute wedges to the monks sitting in the refectory. Each receives a small triangle, a crust of barley loaf, and a smile that only good cheese can summon. And in that moment, you see the power of small indulgences. A round of cheese, a fruit slice tucked into a satchel, a midnight biscuit under a pillow. These weren't rebellions. They were recalibrations. Proof that even within lives of discipline and silence, joy still mattered. So when the cheese arrives next month, and the monks gather with feigned nonchalance and trembling spoons, remember the lesson of the forbidden wheel. Slice it slowly, share it quietly, and always, always, save a bit for someone who missed it the first time. Section 25. Evening has softened into dusk, and the abbey is quieter than it's been all day. You're in the main chapel now, near the back, seated on a low bench with a blanket draped around your shoulders and a final oatcake resting in your palm. You're not hungry, not really. But it's not about hunger anymore. This last meal is silent, unhurried. Around you, the monks move in slow circles, tidying their robes, whispering prayers, folding cloths. No one's in a rush. It's the last pause before sleep, the last crumb before the candle is snuffed. You take a bite of the oatcake. It's plain, chewy, faintly sweet, almost exactly like the one you tasted your first morning here. But now it feels different. Now it carries weight, because you remember the honey loaves of the apiary and the silence of the scriptorium, the vinegar apple slice beneath the garden wall, the forbidden wheel of cheese, shared in cautious joy. The relic biscuit that survived a raid, and the fasting loaf that dared to outlast flavor. You've tasted the work of quiet hands, of simple ingredients mixed with intention. Every bite has told a story, not just of monks, but of a world that knew how to wait, how to listen, how to savor even what had no spice. And here, in the hush of his chapel, you know what they were really making all along. Not just snacks, but peace. Peace that's been kneaded and baked, crumbed and preserved, passed from mouth to memory, from monk to moonlight. As the candle gutters low, you hear a single voice rise, a quiet chant. No lyrics, just sound. It hums like a lullaby for the soul. Around you, the others join in, soft and slow. The walls echo it gently, like the warm silence between shared meals. And in that moment, the oat cake crumbles into something sacred, something eternal. You finish it, not because you're full, but because you're ready. And now, as our long, crumb-strewn journey draws to a close, take a deep breath. Feel the weight leave your shoulders like flour sifted through old fingers. Let the soft warmth of barley and honey and years of patient baking settle into your chest. Imagine the kitchen, quiet now, with just a few last loaves cooling by the hearth. Picture the bundles tucked under robes, the hidden night snacks, the patient stirring of dough by candlelight. No rush, no noise, just intention. Maybe you still taste the ghost of fruit in your mouth. Maybe your fingers remember the feel of flour rubbed between prayers. Maybe you're still holding on to the idea that something so small, an oat cake, a biscuit, a strip of pear, could carry a soul a very long way. Because it can. Monks knew this, that snacks weren't just sustenance. They were stories, quiet gestures, acts of survival, yes, but also acts of care. So let your body rest now. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts drift like steam from a barley loaf on a cold morning. You're safe here. You're full, in every way that matters. And if your dreams tonight carry you to a cold abbey kitchen, with a small bundle of dried fruit in your hand and a long road ahead, know that you'll walk it gently. Snack in one pocket, prayer in the other,